Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 94, Napoleon's Invasion of Egypt. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if you'd like ad-free bonus content, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to our YouTube page, Spotify, or Apple Podcast page and give us a follow. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. Mr. Jonathan Abel, he's a professor in the Midwest of the United States. Jonathan, I'll let you give the details on it, but he also has a podcast called A Confused Heap of Facts, which I think is an interesting thing for everyone to check out. And he's the author of several books in French history. Jonathan, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
Very well, very well. Before we get into your podcast, can you tell us a little bit about your professor job and what you do there?
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor of history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, outside Kansas City. And the Command and General Staff College teaches about half of the Army's majors, plus people from other countries and joint services, at their mid-career professional military education. So senior captains and majors, they're going from company grade to field grade. So we kind of work around the edges of tactics into operational level of war, and then integrating taking an officer from kind of looking down at the tactical level to looking up and out at the broader level as they move on in their career. And I teach military history in that school.
Very good. And before we go any further, the opinions expressed herein are those of the individual and do not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College or any other government agency.
Perfect.
All right. So your podcast, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's it was actually requested by one of the one of the generals who used to be at the Command and General Staff College as a way of outreach. It is PhD historians sitting down talking to each other, which is relatively rare in the podcast space. Podcasting tends to be dominated by journalists most of all. There's certainly nothing wrong with that, but I think the special niche is, like I said, it's a minimum of a PhD historian talking to another PhD historian. And I think what we often find about each other when we talk to each other is that we have expertise in things that we don't necessarily realize. So that comes out, and we have these fun conversations about sometimes better known parts of history, sometimes really arcane parts, and to kind of get into some of the details of military history that people may not necessarily be familiar with.
Okay. So sometimes it's a deep cut that people may not be familiar with, or sometimes it's a broad topic like we're going to discuss today.
Yeah. And it's we range across the board. We'll talk Crusades with our medievalist, John Hostler. We'll talk race in the U.S. Army with somebody like Dr. Amanda Nagel or Dr. Jeremy Maxwell. So it can be anything, and I laugh because we do absolutely no prep for it. My co-host Bill Nance, he'll grab somebody out of an office and we'll sit down and talk for an hour, and it turns into a good podcast. So
I like that impromptu feel to it. Very good.
Yeah.
But again, it's called A Confused Heap of Facts. So please check it out, my listeners, if you get the chance. Okay. Our topic for today is the Egyptian conquest by Napoleon, 1798, 1799. And Napoleon's / France's conquest of Egypt was a 3-year endeavor starting on July 1st, 1798. It's when they landed. And finally ending with a French surrender in September 1801. What was the genesis of this idea? How did Napoleon come up with, hey, let's invade Egypt?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question, and it goes back a ways. So what you often read is that there are roots that go back to the 15th and 16th centuries. I would put it earlier, actually. I would say that the real French interest starts in the 13th century and maybe even the 12th century with the Crusades. the Crusades to the Middle East, now bearing in mind there are Crusades to other places, but the Crusades to the Middle East are dominated by the French. Even if they're not leading the crusade, the crusading armies are composed of many, if not most, contingents from France. So when the Crusades go to the Levant, when they go to the spaces that Napoleon went through himself, they're building a connection that I think will last through the centuries. In particular, in the early to middle 13th century, you have the Fifth Crusade and then the Seventh Crusade. Both of those are directed at Egypt. Now, the Fourth Crusade was originally directed at Egypt as well, but it didn't make it. It kind of diverted itself to Constantinople. But the Fifth and Seventh Crusades actually land in northern, kind of northeastern Nile Delta, Egypt. And in both cases, that's where they stall out. The Fifth Crusade, they end up trading the port there, Damietta, for Jerusalem. The Seventh Crusade, they actually take Damietta again, and then Louis IX, St. Louis, gets trapped there, and he's actually captured and ended up ransomed for something like half of the kingdom's annual revenues. It's a financial disaster. But this is really important, the Seventh Crusade, because during the Seventh Crusade, the Ayyubids, the Fatimids, this is Saladin's people, they have been in charge of Egypt. But during the Seventh Crusade in the 1240s, the Mamluks take control of Egypt. These are the same Mamluks that Napoleon will be fighting centuries later. So the Seventh Crusade is really a major meeting point of France and Egypt, long before you get to the early modern era. And of course, you have the idea that Egypt is the place of old civilization, its own civilization, Roman civilization. And of course, the French all grow up reading about the Romans. And then you get commercial ties that are built later. So you get merchants trading in Egypt, French merchants, as early as the 15th century. Then later you have the famous or infamous Franco-Ottoman alliances beginning in the early 1500s. And then over time, throughout the early modern period, France has increasing trade interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the things that we forget is there's a real intensive French trade network that runs through the Black Sea down to the Syrian coast into the Levant and then across the Mediterranean. This is why they buy Corsica, because Corsica helps control that trade. So there's a long-standing interest, both kind of intellectual and religious, but also commercial, in Egypt.
And there was a political interest too, because wasn't the French government interested in getting Napoleon the heck out of France? Because I mean, this guy, like, crushing Italy, making his own peace accords. So there was probably, they wanted to do something. They didn't know what to do with him, so they're probably thrilled that he wanted to go to Egypt.
Yeah, so that's another big part of it. The directory is kind of, it's somewhat stable. It was kind of a kleptocracy, but it was also, we forget, it was the longest running French revolutionary government, so it did actually function. But yeah, Napoleon is dangerous. He's shown a penchant for not paying attention to the government. He is charismatic. He has support, and he clearly does not want to just sit in Paris and wait for things to happen. So this is part of it. The directors, they need him somewhere else. They need him to not be in Paris. And there's also Napoleon himself is looking for something to do.
And Julius Caesar and Alexander were big influences on him, right? So he wanted to kind of follow in their footsteps.
Yeah. There's a wonderful book called Soldiers and Ghosts by a classicist, and it's about classical people. It's about the Greeks and Romans, but it's really about memory. And the idea is they're all trying to be Achilles from the Iliad or Agamemnon or whoever. And I think that's true of people who are Napoleon's age, who grew up reading particularly about Alexander. It's Napoleon liked to claim he was the mastermind behind the Egyptian expedition. He wasn't. There were plenty of other people involved. One of the main people was Talleyrand, the foreign minister who later becomes the one of the architects of his downfall. Talleyrand wants Napoleon out of Egypt for the same reasons everybody wants out of France for the same reason everybody wants Napoleon out of France. But Talleyrand also realizes there are opportunities there. So there's this memory thing where Napoleon wants to be Alexander, and you go to Egypt because Egypt is where you make gods. That's where men become gods.
Mm-hmm.
But Talleyrand is also looking at this, and he's a very savvy diplomat. He understands that England is vulnerable. There's a couple failed invasion attempts of England and Ireland, but Egypt also can be control of trade, but also a springboard into the Arabian and Indian maritime spaces, and perhaps the beginning of a land bridge into India to contest British control of India. So all of this is getting stirred together after the end of the War of the First Coalition in 1797. Mm-hmm. And all of these reasons are why the Egyptian campaign happens. It's not any one thing. It's a combination of all of them.
Well, let's talk a bit about those rulers of Egypt at the time. Mm-hmm. Since 1517, Egypt was nominally under control of the Ottoman Empire. But as you mentioned, that Mamluks really ruled the country. So it seems like the political situation was, for lack of a better word, chaotic at the time.
Yeah, we tend to think of the Ottoman Empire as this kind of totalitarian, technocratic monolith. Maybe it is under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, but it's certainly not by the 1790s. There are many parts of it that operate more or less autonomously. So people familiar with American history might be familiar with America's first foreign war against the Barbary states, the states of North Africa, which are also technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but they don't really function that way. There might be an Ottoman governor. There might be trade. There might be taxes paid in money or in kind. But the day-to-day administration is devolved to the regional or local level. And this is especially true in a place like Egypt, which has had a coherent identity. It has a group like the Mamluks who are okay running it, again, kind of on a day-to-day level. Now, there is something very important that the Ottomans have that is relevant to Egypt and is relevant across the Muslim world. The Ottomans hold the caliphate. And the caliphate is very important for them, for Sunni Muslims, because they owe religious, let's say, not subordination, but they owe their religious fealty to the caliph. So even if the Ottomans don't exert political control over Egypt, they definitely exert a religious and moral authority. And we're going to see that play once we get into the campaign. So Egypt is a place where you have many layers of tribal, local, regional, and supranational politics all kind of meeting, and the edges can be kind of rough.
Okay. So Napoleon kind of leads a secretive effort to build a force of 40,000 troops and 10,000 sailors for the expedition. Many of the troops didn't even know where they were going when they got on the ships. And it was also, I think, a master class of organization by General Berthier and others. But this part I find very interesting for a conquest. He brings scholars, savants, mathematicians, and non-military personnel along on this expedition. Why do you think he did that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So on the military side of the force, Napoleon is lucky in that there are garrisons around southern France and Italy that he can just pull from. And the vast majority of the force, as you said, it's about 40,000. The majority of it is people who had fought in his army of Italy. They're stationed in Italy proper. They're stationed in Corsica. They're stationed in Provence, around Marseille and Toulon. So all he has to do is gather the ships and then put them on the ships, and they're pretty much good to go. Keeping them in secret is pretty much par for the course. They're trying to keep the British from figuring out what they're doing. Right. They're trying to fool the British so they don't get intercepted by the Royal Navy, the Mediterranean fleet under Nelson. Now, the other side of this, as you point out, is unique to the Egyptian expedition, and that is this crew of savants that go with him. It's about 150 people. Some of whom have very prominent names like Gaspard Monge, the mathematician, or Berthollet, or people like that. And I think one of the other reasons to go to Egypt has to do with what a lot of people have pointed out, particularly Edward Said, who is kind of the original He's the original dean of what we might call anti-Orientalism. Uh, the French look at a place like Egypt and they see a lot of history, but the history runs from the ancient Egyptians through the Romans,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't find much use for anything that follows. In particular, they're not really interested in the history of Islamic Egypt. And at the time, they see Islamic Egypt as being backwards, and they see it as being in need of better caretaking. In the next century, we'll refer to this as the civilizing mission. The idea that Western Europeans go to places that they consider to be primitive, and I'm doing air quotes, civilize them.
So like
And if you,
colonialism,
yeah, it's
basically.
exactly what it is. And if you read Alex Mikaberidze's great book, The Napoleonic Wars, he says that this is not confined to the 19th century. It begins here,
Mm-hmm.
and the Egyptian campaign is pivotal in that. So what he's doing is he's basically saying the people who are in Egypt now have not done a good job of curating and preserving the history and the culture that's there. We're going to go do it for them, which, as you rightly point out, is one of the core ideologies of colonialism. So that's why you have all these savants, and that's why they're kind of along for the ride. It's they're again, I'm doing air quotes, they're rescuing the civilization of Egypt.
It's just interesting, and we'll come back to the savants when we get to the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah.
But Napoleon launches this massive force, and as you mentioned, Nelson and the British Navy they know something's up, but they don't know where they're going or what the point of it is. So how did this huge force slip by the British Navy?
Yeah. So this is one of the things that modern people often have trouble understanding. The ships that they have operate by wind power, and remember, there's no weather radar. That's a relatively modern invention. So the rule in the Age of Sail is you can go where you want about half the time. So Nelson has the better ships, he has the better commanders, he has the better sailors, but weirdly, Nelson is too good for the French fleet. Nelson sails all across the Mediterranean, ping-ponging around, in fact, into and out of Alexandria, while the French are kind of slowly making their way from France to Malta and then to Egypt. And so it's just a matter of luck. It's just simply a matter of the fact that Nelson's fleet can't find the French fleet while it's sailing. I mean, if I remember correctly, one of his ships leaves Alexandria 2 hours before the first French frigates show up for the landing. So it's pure luck.
Okay, so you mentioned though that Napoleon doesn't go straight to Egypt. He stops in Malta, which is a famous island fortress at the time. What happens there?
Yeah, so Malta is in many ways an anachronism, but it's also one that's important. Malta is a relatively small island off the southern coast of Italy today, Sicily. It's kind of in the channel between what is now Tunisia, what at the time would have been Tunis, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. It therefore occupies a very important strategic space in the Mediterranean. It also has a decent harbor at Valletta, which is the capital. So it's a place that you might imagine somebody would want to control if you want to be a Mediterranean power. And in fact, it is fought over by many people over the history of the Mediterranean. Eventually, the British are going to get their hands on it. At the time, it is held by the Knights. And these are an old crusading order that date back centuries, so to those crusades we were talking about. The Knights used to be on Rhodes. The Ottomans took Rhodes, and a pretty bloody siege, actually. And then they eject the Knights, and the Knights settle in Malta, and that's kind of becomes their headquarters.
Not the Knights Templar, though. It's like a different group.
No. The Templar were officially exterminated in
1300.
early late medieval period.
It's like a warrior group like them, kind of.
It's the descendants of one of those crusading orders, and they're just referred to as the Knights or the Knights of Malta. Obviously, we are long past the age of crusades, and a crusading order doesn't really do anything. Really, what Malta is a very interesting place. It's small, but its population is pretty cosmopolitan because the people who become knights come from across Catholic Europe.
Mhm.
Although there's a disproportionate number of them from France. They're mostly French, German. You get some Poles in there too. Um, so in many ways, Malta is overlooked, but it's also still very important and it's coveted. So Napoleon realizes Malta in and of itself is an important strategic base to take, but B, for him to continue to sustain an expedition to the Eastern Mediterranean, he needs to have a base. He's not going to get it in Tunis. He's not going to get it in Sicily.
Right.
He's definitely not going to get it, in on anywhere else.
Mhm.
So he gets it in Malta, and really what he does here is he builds on work that's been done before him. The French have been pulling the strings of French knights for a long time in the order on Malta, and they've been kind of preparing the territory for a French takeover.
Mhm.
The Grand Master of the order is a German named Hompesch. He doesn't seem particularly well regarded by anybody. The French knights, increasingly they seem to be kind of nationalistic, even though oddly they're a medieval crusading order in a revolutionary period.
Mhm.
So when Napoleon lands, there's not a fight. There's not really a sense of a fight. It's just they just land, and the knights are ready to hand the island over to him. And so what we see him do there is we see him do what he does in Italy before this. He remakes the kind of, if you will, the constitution of the island. He puts in place kind of modern French revolutionary laws. He nationalizes the church land. He restructures the church and some of the old, what we call seigneurial rights, those kinds of things.
Well, they arrive in Alexandria, the French and Napoleon, after they leave Malta. In Alexandria on July 1st, quickly take over the city. And then they make a long trek through the desert where thirst and hunger really test Napoleon's men. I know a few of them kind of lose it or die of thirst or commit suicide on the trek. Why did they not have provisions prepared for this trek? Napoleon surely knew there was a desert in Egypt.
Yeah, so there's kind of two ways to answer that. One of it is simply that they did, but we also have to understand how logistics work in the late 18th century. So one of the big problems, and I'm not a naval affairs expert. There are plenty of people who can describe this in much greater details than I can. But one of the major problems is that the ships can only carry so much stuff. And of course, the more you put on the ships, the slower the ships move, and you need to move fast to avoid Nelson. And two, these voyages take a long time, so it's several weeks to get across even half of the Mediterranean. So from Malta to Alexandria, so you have to have food that won't spoil. That means a lot of preserved food, whether that's by salting or curing or whatever. But also food that is calorie dense in a way that will make the cargo not be super heavy. And that includes the other stuff you got to bring on the ship. You got to bring the men, you got to bring their supplies, you got to bring the guns, all that stuff.
Yeah.
So they do have supplies. They have enough supplies for the journey. The supplies aren't great. It's essentially beef jerky and hardtack. But that's what you got, right? They don't have MREs. The thing they're lacking is water. Water is incredibly heavy, and this is a problem today. If I have read correctly, the single most cost inefficient thing to get to the International Space Station is water because it weighs so much. So they're not so much hungry. I haven't found too many accounts of them suffering from hunger during the campaign, but I have absolutely found many accounts of them suffering from thirst. Yeah. Because of course they're overland across the desert.
Yeah, and this isn't Lawrence of Arabia. They don't have clothing fit for trekking equipment. They're wearing their gear for Northern Europe.
They're wearing wool, which is not a good idea in Egypt.
No, not at all. Finally, in mid-July, they arrive on the outskirts of Cairo and win a crushing victory over the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids. What happens here? Because from what I've read, the Mamluks had many brave soldiers and cavalrymen, but it just looks like professional armies of Napoleon just kind of set up square and kind of just let the cavalry break into the squares over and over again, or break onto the square?
Yeah, so there's a lot here, this is the dramatic battle of the campaign. So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on. So what happens when the French land is they push their way into Alexandria. There's a fight. It's like 300 people wounded. So it's a minor fight, but it shows that this is not going to be a walkover. At that point, the Mamluks, there are two main Mamluks. There's Murad Bey and there's Ibrahim Bey.
Yeah.
And at that point, they pull back. So Cairo, of course, it's not on the coast. It's a pretty decent distance up the Nile, basically past the Nile Delta to the south.
Right.
So Napoleon marches overland from Alexandria in order to steal a march on the Mamluks, on Murad and Ibrahim Bey. And when they arrive, there's this kind of it's not really a fortress. It's more like a fortified town on the Nile. So they're coming in from the Nile flows north to south. They're coming in from the west, kind of the northwest, towards the Nile, north of Cairo. And what they do is they have a force that's facing this fortified town, and there's some old cannon there. So it's not, these are not guys with swords fighting guys with muskets. But the town isn't particularly well defended. Mm-hmm. Now, what the Mamluks have is they have a fighting force that consists of two main kinds of troops. The bulk of their forces are Egyptian militia. And these are the standard militia types, basically, random citizen, go grab your gun, come stand in formation and fight, right? This is the citizen militias that America won its independence with.
Right.
The other major Mamluk branch is their cavalry. So the main Mamluk force, it's not the main by size, but it's the main by quality, is their mounted force, their cavalry. And they fight using more or less proper contemporary cavalry tactics, minus having a lot of artillery. That's the thing they really lack.
Right.
So they have good cavalry. The thing they're missing, though, the two things they're missing discipline. This is not a professional army. Even you could argue the Mamluks are not strictly a professional army. They're more of a mercenary force, as odd as that may sound. And they're lacking kind of the trappings of modern warfare in the sense, particularly of having a lot of cavalry, a lot of modern muskets, and all of the support, engineer units, things like that.
Right.
So Napoleon rolls up. He sees the Mamluks on the Nile. He sees the army being gathered. He also sees this fortified town. Now, he has a little flotilla of boats with him, and some of those boats have guns on them. There's also a Mamluk flotilla, so there's actually this little river battle that happens. And what the French realize, and this is not a Napoleon thing, everybody in the French army understands how to do this. The way that you counter cavalry is you form square. You put your men in squares. Now, the squares at the Battle of the Pyramids, as it's called, they're not squares proper. Squares proper tend to be small. They tend to be battalion or regiment size.
Right.
These are big. Yeah. Right, yes, with cannon at the four corners.
Right.
And if you've seen the movie Waterloo, there's a wonderful depiction of exactly how this works.
Right.
So here they're bigger. What Napoleon does is he forms his divisions into squares, and they're not strictly squares; they're rectangles. So he basically pulls all of the support units, all of the wagons, a lot of the guns in the interior of the squares, and then forms the infantry and artillery around the edges. And so, exactly as you say, they do what they're supposed to do. They force the Mamluk cavalry to disperse, because cavalry's quality is in its what the French would call its ensemble, the ability for it to stay together and break an enemy line.
Right.
So the fire coming out of a square is designed to break that.
Ah, and here we have travelers in their natural habitat enjoying guaranteed 4 p.m. checkout at fine hotels and resorts booked through Amex Travel, and they don't even see what's coming at them.
We're in. We got the table.
Yep, with Resi Priority Notify, they're alerted when hard-to-get reservations open up.
Reservation for two? Save the best for last.
Thanks to Amex Platinum, the last day vacation brings yet another experience. That's the powerful backing of American Express. Terms apply. Learn more at americanexpress.com/withAmex.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Right. And horses won't charge. I mean, they'll charge, but they won't charge into like a phalanx of bayonets. They'll turn.
Yeah. I mean, they're animals. They're not machines. You're absolutely right. They do what they want, no matter how much you train them. And they're not stupid. They're not going to charge to their death for the most part. Yeah. So there's a psychological element directed at the horses.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely right. So there's this big dramatic fight, and they win easily. Those two factors, the lack of modern equipment, the lack of discipline on the Mamluk side, really doom their army. And it's, any militia against the experienced professional French army, they're not going to do well. The same thing happens in Spain in a decade. They're just, you can't put amateurs against professionals in a linear, conventional combat and expect them to win.
Okay, so good for Napoleon. He's taken Cairo. However, a few weeks later, the British inflict a devastating defeat on Napoleon's navy at the Battle of the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this such a horrible loss for the outcome of Napoleon's campaign on mainland Egypt? Is it purely logistics, or is it more to it than that?
So, yes, this is a glorious victory. Nelson is an unconventional thinker. He disperses, I wouldn't say destroys, but he disperses the fleet that was supporting Napoleon at Aboukir Bay, essentially reclaims control of the Eastern Mediterranean for the alliance. And I use that term on purpose. It's not just the British anymore.
Right.
But in terms of what might have gone differently, there is no difference than if he hadn't fought a battle at all. If all Nelson had done was to trap the French fleet at Alexandria, the outcome would have been the same, which is Napoleon does not get any more supplies or reinforcements. Right. So the destruction of the fleet is not really material to the larger strategic outcome. And this is something that we talk a lot about at the Command and General Staff College. And it's something that a lot of people who study militaries and military history often trip up on. The outcome of battles has to have a meaning within the larger operational and strategic context. And just because you win or lose a battle doesn't mean it necessarily has higher level meaning.
Well, you bring a good point, because it doesn't prevent Napoleon from carrying on further military operations. He does. He has many other battles. And it does cut his communications with France, and it does prevent some supplies from getting in, like you said, but it doesn't, he doesn't just go up into his castle and say, I'm done. There's nothing I can do. Right.
And as I said, it's not, the choice here isn't between fight and win the battle and do nothing. Just, go sail back to his mistress in Italy. The choice here is between interdict the fleet or destroy the fleet. And, those are essentially the same thing, because they accomplish the same strategic objective. You block Napoleon from receiving supplies and reinforcements for the most part. Now, again, the winds dictate how you operate on the seas, but effectively, Nelson didn't have to fight the battle. He did. He won. It was a brilliant victory. Okay. Also worth pointing out, it's entirely possible the Directory wouldn't have sent any major reinforcements or supplies anyway.
True.
Because, they have other things on their mind by this point.
Yeah, we'll come back to that point as well. So during this time, Napoleon's consolidating his grip on Cairo and in Egypt. And I know, he's doing everything he can to fit in. He's learning about the Quran. He's even dressing in somewhat, Egyptian gear. What changes is he making to the country itself?
So he does in Egypt what he had done in Malta. He essentially revolutionizes it. He uproots a lot of the traditional socio-political structures. He replaces them with what he considers to be proper, modern, rational systems. He declares freedom of religion, along with many other policies, many of them practical. So one of the things that the French do We don't think of the French as engineers and builders. We think of the Germans as that in modern Europe. But in early modern Europe, it's the French who have that particular kind of stereotype about them. So they build a lot of bridges, they dig a lot of canals, they put in street lights. One of the things the French do everywhere they go during the Revolution and Napoleonic periods is they build street lamps everywhere. There's actually a funny story. So they do this in Rome. They put in 15,000 street lamps, and in 1814, the Pope has them removed because they're too modern. It's a literal de-enlightenment.
I like that.
But they're doing that kind of stuff, and they're building hospitals. They're essentially spending a lot of money on Egypt, money that was taken from Switzerland and Italy, which had been recently conquered, that the Ottomans and the local rulers either didn't have or didn't care to spend on kind of public works projects. And that's not necessarily an insult to the local and the Ottoman rulers. It's just they had different priorities.
Right.
So Napoleon's trying to enact reforms in line with the revolution, in line with his own predilections, which are for control and rationalization and optimization. But he is also, in many ways, angering the local populace.
Yeah, we'll come back to that here as well. In late August, he sends out one of his most able generals, Desai, along with future Marshal Davout, on an expedition to Upper Egypt to pursue the Mamluks. How does this venture go?
So it goes pretty well for the most part. Generally, when a French army meets a Mamluk army, the French army wins. In fact, I don't know that there's a single significant combat where that's not true during this campaign until the very, very end. So Desai marches south. He's trying to run down Murad Bey, who's fled into Upper Egypt to reconsolidate. What Murad is doing is he's drawing on local and regional allies. So he's pulling troops in. He's pulling them up from the south. He's trying to pull them across from the Arabian Peninsula. I think there's a couple units of infantry that come from the Hejaz, so either Mecca or Medina. And they, this is kind of a small scale war. This is a few thousand men meeting, a few thousand more men, beating them pretty much at every turn. As you mentioned, Davout is down here. He's a very low ranking, but he gets a couple commands, and he does pretty well. There's one kind of medium-sized battle that he manages to beat a larger force, although not on his own. There's other generals there too.
Right.
But Desai does not accomplish the goal. He is able to hold the opposition there, but he's not able to defeat it. Upper Egypt is a vast place. The wider kind of Red Sea, Arabian Peninsula, Upper Egypt region is an even bigger place, and his small force is not nearly large enough to really do anything about it.
Right.
So he shows the quality of himself and his subordinates and the French troops, but he can't actually accomplish anything towards the strategic pacification of Egypt.
Yeah, but it's probably interesting that he probably gets on Napoleon's radar for a future marshal promotion a few years later.
Yeah, and one of the sayings is that Davout may have gotten Desai's baton.
Yeah, because he unfortunately died of Marengo, Desai. But
This episode is brought to you by Jira. Ever wonder how those big marketing campaigns that make headlines get delivered on time? It all starts with Jira, the only project management tool you need to plan and track work across any team. Every step of that campaign is organised in one place, from launching the campaign all the way back to designing ads and writing creative briefs. Get started on your next big marketing campaign idea today in Jira.
But by October 1798, it seems the Egyptians have had enough of Napoleon and the French invaders, and there's a revolt in Cairo. What kind of ignited this, and how was it repressed?
Yeah, I think to truly answer this question requires some pretty detailed research in some archives in places like Egypt and Turkey. But I think we can generally characterize a couple things that have happened. One of them is ground level. So the reforms Napoleon puts in place and the kind of airs he's putting on, you mentioned he tries to dress in local clothes. He kind of head fakes towards saying, well, maybe we'll convert to Islam. No one buys that. No one buys any of it. They see right through him. They're smart. They understand what's going on. And more than anything, Napoleon's an outsider. Most people in most conflicts throughout all of history just want the outsiders to go away.
Right.
And they really don't buy this idea that the French might be interested in Islam.
Yeah. And even if the reforms are positive, it's an outside idea.
And French revolutionary ideas are not compatible with religion in general, as we find. Same problems in Spain. When he tells the conservative Catholics of Spain, hey, we're bringing you modernization, and they say, nope, we want our priests back.
Right.
So same thing is kind of happening there. Now, at the upper level, a lot is starting to change. And the timeline, a lot of these events are overlapping, but they all kind of feed into each other. One of them is that the Second Coalition is forming. So the Ottomans don't buy that Napoleon is there to fix their province for them, because it turns out they're not stupid either. So they form a new coalition that's directed against France. The other major ally that joins is Russia. The Tsar of Russia, Pavel, wants to be in charge of the Knights. And in fact, he will get himself elected as the Grand Master of the Knights. And he wants Malta back. Or he wants Malta for the Knights back, which is the same thing if you're the Grand Master of the Order. So Russia joins. The first time Russia has joined an anti-French coalition, not the last. So the British throw in, of course. Eventually the Austrians are going to as well. We're going to end up with war in Italy. We're going to end up with war on the Rhine. So one of the things that happens in that is the Ottomans declare not only that they're at war with France and that the French are outsiders at war with the Ottomans, they also declare, to make things simple, they essentially declare that the Caliphate is at war with France. Okay. And when you roll all that together, both the resistance at the local level to change and the upper level Ottoman, the Caliphate and the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, both in a political and a religious way, saying, no, we need to get rid of these French people. That's enough to feed a growing resentment. And one of the expressions of that resentment is the repeated risings of people, particularly in Cairo, the first of which you're talking about. So there's an uprising in Cairo. I wouldn't call it an insurgency. It's more like a series of mob attacks. Considering how big Cairo is, the final death toll is not nearly as bad as it could have been. I've seen numbers of a few dozen to a few hundred French killed, anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 Cairo residents killed. But considering how brutally Napoleon repressed it, the numbers could have been much worse. And that's not necessarily a credit to Napoleon. That's just the way it worked out. But this is the first of many. This is the first of many native resistance movements against the French.
Right. Well, we'll come back to more of those, but I'd like to pivot briefly here and discuss Egyptology and the contribution of the savants. Why was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone such a pivotal moment? And this is probably one of the more positive legacies of this invasion.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would argue it may be the only positive legacy in some ways. So the Rosetta Stone didn't matter at all when it was found. It was a chunk of rock. Everybody recognized what it was, but nobody could do anything with it. And for those not familiar, the Rosetta Stone it's a black slab of stone. It's got 3 writing systems on it: Egyptian hieroglyphs, a kind of Egyptian cursive, and Greek. They could read the Greek. They couldn't read the Egyptian scripts. They can't for decades. The problem with the Egyptian hieroglyphs is they're not an alphabet. They're a series of pictographs. So it's not like you could just use, basically the equivalent of a language model and understand what the phonetic symbols are. So it's not until much, much later. I want to say he starts in the 1830s, but it's a French linguist named Champollion who is finally able to crack the code on the Greek and how it relates back to the hieroglyph pictographs. So it's basically 50 years later. It takes about 50 years for them to really understand how the pictographic system works. And that's what cracks the hieroglyphs. And as you say, this is the single, positive in terms of kind of world understanding of the past element of this campaign, because it enables linguists to unlock the Egyptian script.
Right. They had found, hieroglyphs and like you said, pictographs, but they didn't know how to translate them into any current language, and this kind of helps them do that.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, the Egyptians wrote on everything. They didn't write, they wrote a lot of books, but they also wrote on the walls of their tombs. So if you're familiar with the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it's written on the wall of the temple. And so the ability to read that gave us the ability to understand the ancient Egyptians. And it also advanced linguistics immensely. Now, that would have happened otherwise. We would have gotten around to making the changes in linguistics. We might have figured out hieroglyphs without the Rosetta Stone. But the Rosetta Stone was the Rosetta Stone for Egyptian hieroglyphs, right? Sure. There's a reason it's the axiom. But again, that didn't happen at the time. It didn't happen until much, much later. And I don't think hieroglyphs are fully translated till the end of the 19th century. I mean, it does take a while.
But it allowed Egyptology to really...
It launched Egyptology in Western Europe and America. And of course, that gets fed back into Egypt. The Institute of Egypt today, that's the institute Napoleon founded. It is now run by native Egyptians. And of course, they have the great wealth of the treasures of Egypt, the body of Ramses II, for example. All of that was founded by Napoleon.
Right. Getting back to the military side of it, Napoleon, as we know, is not one to sit around, and he goes on the offensive in 1799. It takes 13,000 troops to attack the Ottoman army in El Arish and then Jaffa. So basically, I guess Palestine, the modern day Palestine, and Israel. How did the start of his campaign go?
So Napoleon understands once the Ottomans are at war, they're going to send large numbers of people south. The Ottomans may be behind on discipline and modern equipment in some ways, but they absolutely have numbers. So the Ottomans dispatched 2 armies to Egypt. One of them is going to come by sea, one of them is going to come by land. So as you say, Napoleon is not a defensive commander. So he marches north up the Levantine coast, and he marches, as you say, into the modern Levantine coast region in Tax el Arish. There's a garrison there. It slows him down. It slows him down enough to allow the defenders of Acre, the old Crusader fortress, to assemble and to shore up their defenses. So at the beginning of the campaign, Napoleon is not moving as fast as he wants. And he's suffering from being in the desert, from a lack of infrastructure. He's got to move his guns on boats. So it's a truly amphibious operation. But he's got to take these small forts before he can get up to Acre, which kind of will give him control of the southern Levantine coast.
Right. What is the aftermath of Jaffa? I know he wins, but a lot of his troops contract plague. And then there's a case of several thousand prisoners who have promised not to fight Napoleon after El Arish, and he counters them again in Jaffa. So he's got to do something with these prisoners, and it's probably one of the most controversial things he's ever done.
Absolutely. So as you point out, 2 important things happen in the Levantine coast. One, plague hits, not for the first time, but in a major way. This is where you get the famous painting of Napoleon visiting the plague victims. But also, Napoleon does order the execution of the prisoners from Jaffa. And this is not really something you do at the time. There are gentlemen's agreements that you parole people. And, every army had encountered soldiers that had been paroled and went back into uniform. It was just part of the way things happened in the early modern period. I would say justifying it on legalistic terms is simply Napoleonic myth. I think the reality is practical. I think he thought he just couldn't handle several thousand prisoners. He didn't want to deal with them. You can't let them loose on the countryside, right? Because there is no countryside. So, he made the unfortunate decision to massacre them. Yeah,
and I know people will say, well, you're looking at it through current day prism sensibilities, but you can't agree
people
with...
at the time were horrified by it too, so that's not just a modern people dunking on the past.
Right, right. Well, he continues his march and encounters his stiffest resistance yet at the Siege of Acre.
Mhm.
Why does he fail here?
So he fails, I think, for two major reasons. Well, I'll throw in a third reason. One of them is that the Brits, under a man named Sidney Smith, are providing exactly what you need for a coastal fortress to hold out against a siege. They're bringing supplies, equipment, reinforcements to the garrison, including, of course, if you've got ships, you've got guns. If you've got guns, you've got gunners. That's exactly what you need to help fight off a siege, along with the equipment. Two, Acre is a notoriously difficult fortress to get into. Crusades broke on it. One of my colleagues, Dr. John Hostler, has written about this extensively. But Napoleon's going to break on it too. So it's not, think of it kind of, it's not quite like Gibraltar, but it's not far off. It's just really hard to conduct a siege of.
Yeah.
And then finally, Napoleon has a small army far from the end of its supply line. He's got a few siege guns, but not enough. He just doesn't have enough of what he needs. And it's worth pointing out, Acre is not exactly the kind of siege he had trained to do, where you dig the lines of circumvallation and then you dig your approach trenches. It doesn't really work in that terrain in the same way it does in Northern Europe. So when you put all those things together, you get a fortress that's really hard to break into. And on top of that, the defenders defend it really well. There's a crew of Turks defending it. They're supported by some émigré French, in particular some artillery officers, the British. And there's a famous incident where one of the attacks, if I remember correctly, it's under the future Marshal Lannes, gets past the wall. They make a breach in the wall, and they do the thing that Titus actually found in the attack on Jerusalem in the First Jewish War. There's another wall behind it. So they're through the wall. They finally got done what they need to, and there's another wall they got to get over.
Another wall, yeah.
So yeah, it's not going to happen. And it's, Acre is a tough nut to crack in perfect circumstances, and these circumstances are far from perfect.
Yeah, but during the siege, he manages to win another victory at Mount Tabor, which is a horrible loss to the Ottomans. I actually saw this battle on like the top 10 last stands thread on Twitter. Can you sum up this battle? Because Napoleon's not there initially; it's one of his subordinates.
So, at Mount Tabor, this is the main Ottoman land army. So they're marching south. This is a standard Turkish army, although it's still very cavalry heavy. What Napoleon does is he has a small force. I mean, it's essentially a couple regiments under Kléber. Probably his most skilled subordinate in this campaign, and that's saying a lot.
Good general.
Yeah, very good general. He sends Kléber out the same way he had sent Desailly out to Upper Egypt. Kléber is kind of, keeping the countryside from allowing armies to approach the siege. Kléber runs into this Ottoman army. And again, the numbers it's hard to say, probably, maybe let's call it 20,000 militia and, 5,000-6,000 cavalry. So, standard Levantine Ottoman army. And Kléber manages to hold them off for 10 hours, I think, with one dead.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Which honestly, that speaks to the incompetence of the attacking army. That's not with those small numbers. No matter how good your equipment is, you will not be able to hold against superior numbers that are acting properly. So the Ottoman army is just not doing anything effective here. They're about to overrun Kléber. Napoleon dramatically shows up, defeats them, disperses the army. The army kind of breaks down into its constituent parts. The militiamen go home, just like the American militia do after a defeat in the American Independence War. And so that enables him to try to continue the siege, but of course to no real avail.
Right. Yeah, and he eventually has to abandon the siege, which is, Napoleon hates to lose any kind of battle.
Right.
But he famously decrees, quote, after feeding the war for 3 months in the heart of Syria, taking 40 guns, 50 flags, 10,000 prisoners, raising the fortifications of Gaza, Jaffa, and Acre, we shall return to Egypt, end quote. I mean, this is clearly a spin doctoring of a failed expedition, but he can't say that, right? He can't march back in Egypt and say we failed. He has to make it like a positive for his troops and for history, I guess.
Yeah, and exfiltration is always difficult in the best of times. You're right. This is purely Napoleonic propaganda. Although it's not wrong if you take out the Acre part.
True.
He did nothing substantial to the fortress at Acre, but he did do a lot with a relatively small force. 40,000 men is a tiny army to invade a country the size of Egypt. He did okay. He did more or less what he needed to. But yeah, he's not going to accomplish anything of note beyond basically having taken Cairo from a military force that was simply not ready to fight him. So yeah, we have to give him credit where credit's due, and especially his subordinates. There are very few French generals who are not very good in this campaign.
Yeah,
But yeah, this is purely propaganda.
Well, once back in Cairo, he learns of affairs in Europe from British newspapers and of French setbacks in Italy from that second coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes the controversial decision to leave his army behind and return to France with a small handful of followers, including future marshals Lannes, Berthier, Murat, and Marmont.
Mm-hmm.
In fairness, he was requested to return to France by the government twice, but these messages were intercepted by the naval blockade. What is your view on this? Did Napoleon make the right decision?
I think the answer to that is basically the answer to whether or not you like Napoleon. What I would say is I think you're right. I think there is obviously an element of personal survival and personal aggrandizement. Napoleon would have fled Egypt whether he had orders to or not.
True.
But that doesn't necessarily make it the wrong choice. Now, the question is not whether or not he should have fled Egypt. The question is whether he should have abandoned his army there.
Right.
And I think we can say unequivocally he did abandon his army there.
Oh yeah.
Yes, Napoleon's about to go overthrow the government, and we can probably say he did save the French Revolution by overthrowing the government. It's a weird way to say it, but it's probably true. He certainly can be credited for self-preservation. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but he also can be debited for abandoning Kléber and the army, leaving it in Egypt.
Yeah, it's a tough question. Was it better for his career? Absolutely. Was it better for France? Debatable. Was it better for the army in Egypt? Well, we're about to see probably not. So after Napoleon leaves, Kléber is the new commander-in-chief. But what happens to Kléber and the French army once Napoleon's gone?
So Kléber is going to fight a couple of battles. Before he left, Napoleon had defeated the seaborne Ottoman army at Aboukir. They land. Napoleon basically just destroys the army. There are more forces that land. The British will land an Ottoman force, and Kléber has to do some pretty fancy maneuvering to dance around and play on interior lines and defeat all these armies. So he shows his quality, wins a big victory at Heliopolis, and is immediately assassinated. And that leaves the army lacking good leadership, but frankly, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. Yes, Kléber's death deprives France of a good general for the future, but the army's done. All the British have to do is shuffle in more support until they can finally pin the French down. The French are never truly defeated. Kléber's heir basically just surrenders because he knows Menou. The situation is hopeless. But Kléber would have too. They're not getting
resupplied. They're not getting fresh troops. Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah. And also, if they can't maintain a connection back to France, what are they doing there in the first place?
Well, this is my last question, and it's kind of there may not be a legacy, but is there a legacy to the French conquest in Egypt?
This is a sticky question because I think it touches on a lot of the challenges with how this campaign has been talked about in the past. If you had asked somebody this question, 100 years ago, their answer would have been immediate. It was I'm doing air quotes, civilization arriving in Egypt, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a neo-colonial idea. I think we've rolled back a lot of that. I think we've come to realize that, Egypt was perfectly civilized before the French showed up, and it was afterwards. Yes, as we talked about earlier, the foundation of the Institute of Egypt, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, those do spark Egyptology. Those are very important. Who's to say those things wouldn't have happened anyway? Really, it was just the French directed a funding stream at Egypt, and that may have happened eventually. The French presence there also catalyzes kind of a native Egyptian movement, and we're going to start moving Egypt down the road to at least semi-independence, although at least well into the 20th century, it remains essentially a protectorate of Western European countries.
But
and
it's Napoleon's legend too, though, right? Like, even though it's in theory, it kind of helps. When he gets back in France, he's almost like a conquering hero, even though he fled there. Yeah, it's strange.
Yeah, well, so on the Napoleon side, this is a question that people have been debating, since his lifetime. And there's a wonderful book, Peter Giles, Napoleon for or Against. I mean, it's now almost 100 years old, but it sketches all this out, the different views of Napoleon. And yeah, there are two ways to look at this: that this was a fiasco, it was a boondoggle, that Napoleon showed his true colors, right, abandoning his army. I think that's a little too harsh. There are elements of it that are true, but again, he didn't mastermind it, so it's not his fault the expedition happened. Yes, he went, but but I think you touch on something really important, and I think there's a reason we talk about this campaign still today. Egypt is a place of myth. It's a place of romance and wonder. It's not an accident that Agatha Christie set one of her best stories there. It's a place that draws our interest, just like it drew Napoleon's interest, just like it drew the interests of the Crusaders centuries before him. Yeah. It's a place where you can walk out and see a temple that is 4,000 years old. It's one of the only places in the world you can do that.
Yeah.
And it's next to a mosque that's, 1,500 years old.
Right.
Well, more like 1,200, but still. And it's, there's a magic to water as well, whether it's the ocean or it's a big river like the Nile. And when you put those two together, you get Egypt, right? I mean, the original name of Egypt is like the black sand, right? It's where the river floods. Yeah. So I think we like Egypt for the same reasons Napoleon did, because we like to look at that giant statue of Ramses or the face of Akhenaten in that really striking Amarna style. And we want to know who these men were. We want to know who Hatshepsut was and these great women as well.
Yeah.
And Egypt it's not unique in that, but it's rare in that. It has this call to us, just like it's called people for the last 5,000 years. And Napoleon is no different.
Yeah. Mark Antony, Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great. And just for the record, for those who have seen the movie, no, Napoleon did not fire a cannon into the pyramids.
Yeah, that's an old myth. Another old myth that he shot the nose off the Sphinx. The nose had been missing since at least 1600. It basically fell off. Yeah, you're right. That's an old Napoleonic saw. That's simply not true. Actually, the Sphinx was buried up to its neck when he got there. It had not. The people, conservative Muslims, they're not particularly keen on pre-Muslim art that depicts people, so it makes sense that they wouldn't necessarily have maintained those monuments. Yeah. But yeah, it's as you point out, the movie scenes there are kind of weird.
Right, yeah. But yeah, no, that's a great summary. I appreciate that very much, Jonathan. And again, Jonathan's podcast, Confused Heap of Facts. And if you want to learn more about Jonathan Abel, there's many books that you can find on him. And we appreciate him coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, John. This was a good time.